Like, you have to be very trolled up here to say that. Hello, did you miss me? Today we're talking about the books I read in June and July 2020. The first book that I read is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and this is a BOOKTUBE favorite. If you don't know what this book is about, here we follow Evelyn Hugo. She's like the Marilyn Monroe if she would have lived until her old age, and everybody is very curious about her life, especially because she married 7 men. And everyone is wondering who was her real love. And Monique is a reporter and almost nobody, and Evelyn Hugo picks her to tell her story. I could tell you and tell you about this book, and anyone could also do the same, and if they don't tell you spoilers, you are never going to get really the hang of it. And I was expecting something about this book, and I didn't get it, even though I was not disappointed. I have to say that when I met the character that I was expecting the more to meet, I hated that character. And I'm talking about Evelyn Hugo's true love. At some times I seriously consider going back in the book and checking what did Evelyn Hugo see in this person. Even though Evelyn Hugo is one of the most manipulative and ambitious persons that I know, and I don't agree with everything that she thought or every one of her philosophies, I sometimes cheered for her, and she made me feel very empowered. Taylor Jenkins Reid has a very simple yet impactful prose. Even though we spent most of the book in a world that I think is one of the ones that causes the most curiosity in the world, and I'm talking about the world of Hollywood, I think that some of my questions were still left unanswered, and I don't know if it was because there was lack of research or because the author simply didn't think that this was the point of the story. But for example, I thought that the life of Evelyn Hugo when she was just starting in Hollywood to when she was one of the most famous stars didn't really change a lot. I get all of the hype that this book has, and I think that it deserves it. Even with that, I couldn't love it, maybe because I couldn't really relate with Evelyn Hugo. I can't relate with someone that wants fame that much, and for reasons I couldn't read this book fast enough. I was reading it with someone and I had to wait for that someone, and I don't know if that affected my enjoyment. Evelyn Hugo had always a goal in sight, and even though she says and she makes you believe that that is what she wants the most in life, I couldn't help but think that her goal, she hated it, and why did she even fight that much for it, and why did she even sacrifice that much for it? My next two reads were book 2 and 3 of the Dyer trilogy, and to keep this review spoiler free, I am going to recap what I read in the first book. What caught me was that Dyer is the only survivor of a building falling on top of her head, and she came out of it without a scratch. Well, maybe only a black eye. The second book was my favorite. Even though Mara and Noah's romance is very cringy, she literally says at one point that Noah's arms were a perfect cage. Like, you have to be very trolled up here to say that. The whole climax of the book would have been solved if Mara had been a responsible adult. Of course, I'm not going to say what I'm talking about here because this is spoiler free, but if you're curious, you can go to my Goodreads account and read what I'm talking about. I always leave that in the description below. The third book turns very dark, and I think I'm very comfy with dark books and dark themes. I personally wasn't a fan of the ending. I think the writer threw a bunch of questions at us at the last moment, and then she was like, but who cares about that? My next book was a modern Mexican classic, and this is Like Water for Chocolate. Some of you guys have asked me for some Hispanic or Mexican recommendations, and this is one of them. In here we follow Tita, our protagonist. She is from a Mexican family that lives at the border of Mexico. Some of the story is also centered in the United States and also with some American characters, and she lives in the Mexican Revolution times. To her disgrace, she is the youngest daughter of a family that has a very peculiar tradition, and this is that the youngest daughter of said family is never going to marry or have kids because she has to take care of her mom for all her life. This is very inconvenient for Tita because not only does she fall in love, but she falls in love with her sister's future fiancé, and this screams scandal. I love Laura Esquivel's prose. It is simply chef's kiss. And this book is going to make you hate Tita's mother with all your heart, and I also hated Tita's love with all my heart. I'm going to say this again: if you're looking for a Hispanic read or something that was originally written in Spanish, this is a great book, not only because it is so short, but because it is so magical. And talking of it, this has some hints of magical realism. My next read was An Anonymous Girl, and this is my second read from the duo of Greer Hendricks and Sarah Buchanan. They wrote The Wife Between Us. And this one I like the most. You're going to see why in a second. Here we follow Jessica, and she is a young girl that is in a little bit of an economical need because she has a sister that needs some special care. One day she is faced with the opportunity to make some easy money, and the only thing that she has to do is to answer a questionnaire for a psychologist that is doing a study in ethics. Apparently she's doing very well because this psychologist keeps asking her to come back, and she starts getting more money, and then she starts getting some tasks in which she is told what to wear, how to do her hair and her makeup, and how to act. And even though she thinks this is kind of fishy, she doesn't say a thing because she really does need that money. And the reason why I love this book so much is because it has one of the cliches that I love, that is that character that you love to hate. The next book that I read was Shadow and Bone. They are turning this into a Netflix original series, and this is by famous author Lee Bardugo. In here we follow Alina, and she appears to be a nobody. She's an orphan. She grew up with her best friend Mal, and she turned to be a map maker. One day she's traveling through the Fold, which is a wasteland in which some creatures that eat human flesh have made it impossible for this territory to prosper. Alina turned out to have a very special power, which is light, and you're going to be like, why don't they just use a flashlight? I don't know exactly the time that this book is set in, but I only know that they had pistols, but apparently they didn't have electricity. A lot of people that review this book are going to spoil it for you, and I'm not going to do that, but one of the things that I have to say is that I have an unpopular opinion because everybody is trashed for the Darkling and everybody loves his granite eyes, and apparently this is very sexy for some people. You gotta know that when a character has a crooked smile or a half smile, something is going to happen. One of the things that made this book more special to me is that I read it during the only trip that we've made this year. We went to Dragonsteel, which is in between North Carolina and Tennessee, and this is a very popular destination for people that love motorcycles, and my husband loves motorcycles. So while he was doing one of the activities that he loved the most, I was doing one of the activities that I loved the most, and that made this book so much more special for me. Another unpopular opinion that I have about this book is that two characters are kind of famous for being boring and bland, and I didn't think they were quite that much. I didn't love them, but I didn't hate them. And the last book that I read was The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield. And I have to make a confession. This book might overthrow the Nightingale. I know that is something very strong to say right now. I just finished it some 3 hours ago, and when I tell you the synopsis of this book, it's going to sound very familiar. I came into this book knowing nothing, and I think that's probably the best way to come into it, so if you want to read it, you can skip ahead. But the synopsis of this book says that we follow Margaret, and she's a biographist, and she is asked to make the biography of Vida Winter, and she might be the equal of J.K. Rowling in another universe, the universe of this book, because she is the most famous author of her time. Everybody is wondering what her real story is, and whenever a reporter comes and asks her that, she tells them a different story. For example, she might tell them that she lived with some monks and she went in some missions with them, or she might tell them that she is the daughter of a European princess and that she was separated from her at birth. She always gives a different version of her story, and it appears that everybody is content with it because she has a beautiful way of telling stories. I think Diane Setterfield has a true talent with prose, because seriously, I could read her grocery list. I know this is something very common to say, but I don't say that about anybody. I might say that only about Stephen King, but Diane Setterfield came and said, Stephen King, get out of here. I'm not going to spoil you whether The Nightingale or The 13th Tale is the best one in my heart, because if I had filmed this before filming the mid-year book freak-out tag, I would have had to say that secret. But since it's still 5 months until the end of the year and I tell you the best books that I read in this year, I'm going to keep that secret for myself. I also like to talk about the shows and movies that I watched during the month, and the first one that I watched is Club of Crows. This is a Mexican show and you can find it in Netflix. It has very Mexican humor and we follow two siblings that own a Mexican soccer team, and whenever I heard people talking about the show, I was like, what's interesting about following the owners of a Mexican soccer team if I don't even like soccer? In my opinion, soccer is like the telenovelas of men, because the most that you see there is acting. But I got to say that this book really impressed me. It has very Mexican humor, and I have to say that it has a better ending than Game of Thrones. The next movie that I saw was My Spy. I believe it's a Netflix original and you can find it there. And here we follow the actor that plays Drax in the Guardians of the Galaxy. I think I love the way this actor performs, because every movie that I've seen of him just cracks me up. And he's a spy that is very skillful with his force and with speed and everything that's related to his body, but he's not very skillful when he's mind. And when he steps up in the FBI and he has to use his brain to do some missions, he finds out that even an 8-year-old can be challenging because he's not very good at it. And the last movie that I saw was The Old Guard. I believe it's a Netflix original and you can find it there. And we follow a squad of warriors that have lived many years. The oldest of them, she might be as old as time, and she is played by Charlize Theron. And it might sound very cliche and we might have seen this story a lot, but I was very impressed, and in a good way. That's all for today. The secret phrase for today is Mexican classics. Type that in the comments below so that I know that you stuck until the end, and that would make me very happy. Don't forget to like, subscribe if you haven't done so already, and hit the notification bell, and I'll see you next week with a new video.